All right, well, thanks for joining me. I know it's the end of the day. This is the last session. So you're tired, I'm tired. Your brain is probably fully saturated. But let me try to squeak in a few more tips and tricks for Visual Studio. I'm John. I'm a program manager at Microsoft, and I'm on the Tools for Unity team. This week, I've been mostly over at the Microsoft booth talking to developers about what GameStack is. So real quickly, let me tell you what that is. That's the #1 question that I got this week. GameStack is over 30 tools and services that we've seen game developers use within Microsoft, and we're kind of bringing them all together and tightening up the integration between them to kind of cover every scenario that you would encounter building, creating, and operating a game. So it includes all the services that and tools that you'd be familiar with, including Visual Studio. So if you have any questions about GameStack or any scenarios you're running into, definitely stop by. If you have a little bit of time left in the show, you can talk to us about that. Quick disclaimer. So some of the tips and tricks that I've had, it might be obvious to you, maybe not. If you've been using Visual Studio for a long time, you might say, duh. But hopefully there'll be something you can pick up. I think there's a few in here, even a seasoned veteran might be interested in. And then if you're a beginner, that's perfect. I think a lot of it will be relevant to you. Tip 0 is all about exploring the IDE. So I had some conversations this week about using other editors or even using something more akin to a text editor, and like, why do I need an IDE? So what I've done is I've kind of put together some of the features that I've heard from speaking to developers like yourselves about what they like about an IDE. So there's lots of support for refactoring, for code navigation. We have productivity enhancements that you don't get out of other tools. We have analysis and ways to sync changes between your teams. You can customize everything that you would want, custom layouts and light and dark themes, which is super important, obviously. So there's all that fun stuff. And then for Unity, we have what we call the Tools for Unity, which is an extension that's included when you install Visual Studio, and also it's included on Mac and Visual Studio for Mac. And what that does is it adds a couple little extra flavors for you. So Intellisense support for the Unity messages. It adds debugging support. We have some productivity enhancements like attaching to the editor and playing it right away, so you don't have to swap back and forth. And you can quickly access the Unity documentation, and you can also save some time by not having to switch, or when you switch back and forth to the Unity editor. So we'll automatically refresh assets every time you save. So when you switch back to Unity, that compilation process may already be done. So it saves you a little bit of time there. So let me dive right into it. Tip #1 is about getting the latest optimizations. So again, that might seem obvious, but when I talk to developers, I find out not a lot of them update Visual Studio. Maybe you're stuck with a specific Unity version for the length of a project, then you kind of lock into that version so you can maintain it. Visual Studio, you can update that independently of Unity, and we make sure that those things don't break in between. And the reason I think that is important to highlight is we're constantly working on the performance of Visual Studio on both Windows and Mac. And recently we had some performance improvements for developers that were seeing like 20-second load times of solutions on big projects, which is obviously a huge performance penalty. And we were working to get that down, and we got down to about 9 seconds. And so that just happened in 15.8.2. That's a point release. So just keeping things up to date, you'll get those included benefits. And then I also, this is how you can do it. It's super simple in Visual Studio. On the left is Windows, on the right is how you do it in Mac. Just go to check for updates, and you'll see what's available, and you can see the release notes there to find out what's changed. To highlight a couple things we've done recently that might be interesting to you. So we've added some different support for the Unity Project Explorer. If you're not familiar with that, I'll talk about that in a second. Like I just said, we increased project reloading, so that way that's a little bit faster. Debugging time is much quicker. And we have more support for unsafe debugging code, which is becoming more and more important as the dots world increases. And then just as of Monday, we also finally have some deeper understanding of Unity with Unity-specific analyzers, diagnostics, refactoring options. This is a simple example here I have in this image, just showing you some things that we can understand now inside the editor. So trying to take up some Unity best practices and give you the tools to quickly kind of scan your code and suggest things that you might want to do specific to the Unity context. And that's available in the latest version of 16.3 and 8.3, which came out on Monday. Save time by leaving Visual Studio open. So I had some surprises when I was speaking to developers that you might jump into the editor, do some changes, close it, thinking you won't go back to it, but then later you do. Cold launching Visual Studio has a performance penalty. So you can leave the editor open, there's no problem with that, and we'll synchronize the changes as you operate back and forth. So it saves you a little bit of time so you don't have to cold start Visual Studio. Tip 3, you can reduce the time that it takes to load your solution by basically unchecking this box. If you don't care about restoring the project hierarchy, so if you launch your solution and you wanted to unfold all the folders and all the right to the file you had open the last time, then don't uncheck this. But if you don't care about that, which talking to Unity developers, sometimes they really don't care about this when they jump into a Unity project, you can get a performance boost by not restoring that, or just open up the solution and then you can go to the file that you want to directly. You can access Unity documentation right from within the editor on Windows and Mac. So here's a quick image on how to do that, but you basically can highlight any Unity function. You can go to the Help menu and go to the Unity API reference menu option, or you can hit this keyboard shortcut and it'll launch a browser either inside the IDE if you prefer, or it can launch your preferred external browser, whichever you want. You can also save some time with lots of keyboard navigation support, and my favorite is just being able to search. You just hit a keyboard shortcut and be able to search pretty much anything in your entire project, and then you can hit enter real fast and open it. It saves you time. You don't have to click on anything. That works both on Windows and Mac. So the top is what it looks like on Windows. Mac, it looks very similar. And if you missed it, these are the keyboard shortcuts to quickly open that. If you have a long file that you're scanning with lots of code, I find it super helpful that you can quickly identify the Unity API methods by customizing the fonts and colors for those messages. So here's what that looks like. We have a font setting for Unity message, and I've set it to purple. That's my preference. So that way any of the Unity API event messages will be a different color. It makes it a little easier when you're scanning your code, see exactly what's yours and what might be a Unity message. Earlier I mentioned the Unity Project Explorer. So we have in the Unity editor, your folders and assets and everything are organized one way, but traditionally in Visual Studio we show the Solution Explorer, which is what you see on the right. And that has a lot of nasty stuff you may not care about in a Unity project. So we have the Unity Project Explorer, which is what you see on the left. So we'll map that kind of one-to-one to what you see in Unity. So when you bounce back and forth, it's much easier to navigate. And in 2019, that's on by default. But if you don't have that, you can enable it by, oh, there it is, Shift-Alt-E or in the View menu. And on Mac, we actually override the Solution Explorer, so you'll automatically get the Project Explorer by default. So there's nothing you have to do on Mac. It's automatically showing it exactly like it does on the Unity editor. If you're using both Solution Explorer and the Unity Project Explorer, then you can synchronize the changes between them as you click files around. So for example, if you have both of these open like I do in the IDE side by side, then as you click a file on the left, you can synchronize it on the right and vice versa. So as you navigate between them, you can see exactly where your files are, and you can do that by updating this setting. So we have a couple settings specifically for tools for Unity. You can see what they are here. So you can go in and tweak those, just kind of disable some things you don't want or enable some that you do. You can save a little bit of time when you are doing your debugging flow. So if you're going back and forth between Visual Studio and the Unity editor, you can speed things up a little bit by using the attach and play. So instead of just clicking attach and then switching back to Unity and pressing play, instead you can use the attach and play configuration, which is what you see in this image, and then it'll be a one-step operation. We'll attach the debugger and play Unity all in one, and you'll get right into debugging a lot faster, so you don't have to leave the IDE. This is a quick tip I found on the hashtag VSTips on Twitter, which has a lot of great tips, so I pulled one because I thought it was interesting to me. Sometimes Intellisense gets in the way. You can make it transparent. I did not know this, but you just hold Control. That makes it transparent, and then you can see the rest of your code. So it's just a quick tip. Sometimes it gets in my way as I'm working on my Unity files. So tip 11 is about IntelliCode. IntelliCode is our AI-powered and machine learning model for improving IntelliSense. IntelliSense is probably one of the main reasons that you would use an IDE, and the main feature I hear that developers like about using an IDE. So you want to make it better. Here's an example of what it looks like before on the left. Before IntelliCode, you just see the normal C# autocomplete. It's in the default ordering. Then what I did is, on this particular example, I trained it on the FPS sample product. So what that looks like is you download the FPS sample project, open it in Visual Studio, open the IntelliCode menu and hit train on my code. That generates an ML model based on that solution and then gives me suggestions now for any project that I use based on what it learned from there. So it bumps up things to the top, but it's also a little bit smarter than that too. If it starts to recognize patterns in your code, it'll start to suggest things based on those patterns and not necessarily just like the most frequently used thing like in vector here. But also IntelliCode will do things like if you are refactoring, like if you have a bunch of if statements in a project and then you refactor that saying, oh, too many if statements, let me convert that to a switch statement or something. If you have other places in your code that do that, then IntelliCode will recognize that and say, the next time I see that same amount of if statements or the same pattern, do you want to refactor that into a switch statement? And it does that for anything. And Unity is supported by default as well. So in 2019, that is on by default on Windows. We don't have it for Mac yet. And then in 2017, it's an extension. So if you're still in 2017, you can just go to the marketplace and install it, and same support there. Tip 12 is about Visual Studio Live Share. So you can solve problems a little bit faster if you're working with a team or you have some colleagues that you need to work with remotely. Live Share is a pretty cool tool that I haven't seen used too much by Unity developers. They're not super aware of it yet. So I want to spread a little bit of awareness about it. So what you can do is in Visual Studio, you can just click the share button. It generates a link for you. You can share that link with anyone that has Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code installed. And then what it does is it creates a sharing session between the two, and it gives them the code that you want them to see without having to install anything except for the editor. And they don't have to install Unity. They don't have to download your repo. They'll just give them the files, and you can have like a collaborative editing session. So you can see my friend Matt joins me in my session. He doesn't have any of my code. He doesn't have Unity installed. And then he can see my breakpoints. I can see breakpoints he sets. And we can step through code. He can step, I can step. We can both inspect the same variables. There's a chat server in there, so if we don't have another way to voice chat or communicate, you can chat right within Visual Studio. So you can get a lot of collaborative editing experiences you might be used to from other online editing tools right inside Visual Studio. And that right now that works on Visual Studio for Windows and also Visual Studio Code. So if you're working on Mac, you could go into Code, hit share, and send it to someone on Windows or someone on Linux. It's totally cross-platform there. So my last tip is about influencing how we iterate on Visual Studio. How do we improve the tools for Unity? When I speak to developers at the booth or online, they often have some really awesome ideas. What I always tell them, the best way to share how you want Visual Studio to change to improve Unity is through our developer community portal. And it's really easy to get to from the IDE on both Windows and Mac. You just go to help and then either report a problem if you have a bug or an issue, or if you have a feature, submit a feature, or submit a suggestion, I think it's called. And then what that does, it launches this browser window, which is the developer community portal. You can type in whatever your issue is or whatever your suggestion is, and then our team triages that. It's not a black hole. It's not going to get lost. We look at that pretty much every day. And that's how we kind of shape the future of what happens. So, for example, the list of things I showed you of what was recently done in Visual Studio, that comes from suggestions like this. So we saw developers really wanted to see Unity-specific analyzers and diagnostics and refactoring suggestions that were particular to the Unity scenario. That's how we crafted this, that feature, is directly from feedback like this and from speaking with you one-on-one. So it's super important that you share the issues you have with us, but also the things that you want to see, because that does actually make it into the IDE. So I'm finished a little bit early to give you some time back. But if you have any questions, be happy to answer them, or you can come speak to me here. If not, I'll be back over at the Microsoft booth for the rest of the show. Love to hear about your experience in Visual Studio, things you love, things you don't love as much, or any questions you have. And if you are interested in connecting with me one-on-one, maybe after the show, go to this URL. You'll get a quick survey, which is just one box to fill in your contact information, and I'll reach out to you. And I'll pick a random person from this to win an Xbox 800LX wireless headset that we have over there at the booth. So if you can share your feedback before the end of the show, I'll pick someone from the feedback there and contact you with whatever you share with me, and then we can talk after the show too. And there's my contact information if you have anything else you want to follow up with me about. So thank you.